Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's my name's Adrian Marshall. I'm the facilitator of the Grassy Plains Network, and we're part of the Victorian National Parks Association these days. We're very lucky to have I'm really looking forward to tonight's talk. I think this is about our 35th. I've lost track now of the numbers, but it's like we're well into our fourth year of doing these. So it's amazing how many different topics you can talk about on grasslands and still not run out. Our next one after Dan tonight is going to be on fungi. So, we haven't done fungi before. We haven't actually done grasses before. So I'm looking forward to grasses as well. My whiteboard has just opened up. How did that happen? Did somebody do that to me? Someone must have done that to me, you tricky people. It's anyway. So before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm talking to you from Wurundjeri country, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and all of you will be all from all over Victoria and the amazing First Nations people who have looked after country for so long and done such a incredible job of keeping Victoria, or the place that now has the name Victoria, being the most biodiverse and incredible landscape that we sadly set back substantially, but hopefully we'll be able to move forward together and make things better. Anyway, so tonight we have Dan Nugent back for a second time. So which is fantastic. What do I have to tell you about Dr. Dan? He's a reserve manager and ecologist at Bush Heritage Victoria. He's got like a decade and a half of experience in ecological restoration and conservation research as well across the state. He's president of the Northern Plains Conservation Management Network, and the Friends of Terrick National Park, both two very long names, which work under the name Northern Plains Conservation Alliance, which is at least only 4 words. And he's also involved with the conservation partners on the Patho Plains, which is a new initiative being supported to support grassland graziers. So I'm very interested to hear more about that. Dan's not going to share his screen, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to share. Dan has pre-recorded his talk tonight because he's got a terrible internet connection. So I am going to share my screen and we'll have live questions from Dan at the end. Dan, did you want to say anything by way of introduction before I share my screen, or
No, I think you nailed it
okay?
there, Adrian. You can hit go, then I'll hang around for questions at the end.
All right, fantastic. Now, for some reason, Dan, I had it up just before and it's vanished. Now it's just going to be one of those nights, isn't it? This was supposed to speed thing. Oh, look, there we go. Oh, it's under media. That's why it's not working. Oh, media player. Okay. That's why it's not opening in PowerPoint. Pardon me, Dan. Pardon me, everyone. I haven't been paying attention as much as I should. I had it all lined up, and now I don't. Okay, so stop you there. Share my screen. Apologies. Okay, should all be able to see that now. Someone give me a thumbs up there. Yep,
Yep, good.
thank you. All right, and we are off.
Okay, so my talk today is about when is grassy grazing good. Really, it's about what role can livestock grazing play in grassland management. Before I get going, I'd just like to place some caveats on this talk and highlight what it's going to be about. Much of the information I present in this talk are opinions based on my observations and experience from my time working on Victoria's volcanic plains and Victoria's northern plains grasslands for the past 15 years. Where I can, I do present data from some of my PhD research looking at the effects of livestock grazing, which was from a few years ago. The talk is also mostly relevant to lowland native tussock forming grasslands of southeastern Australia. Outside of this region, there are likely to be added complexities. It also doesn't address the role of grazing in ecosystems like grassy woodlands or derived native grasslands. That's because tree and shrub recruitment have another layer of complexities we won't have time to go over, but hopefully that's for another talk. Before I go further, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the places which we live, work and play, recognise and pay respect to the enduring relationships they have with their lands and waters, and pay respect to elders past and present, especially acknowledgement to Jara, the traditional custodians where I'm calling in from, where I live in Bendigo. I'd also like to acknowledge that some of the topics covered in this talk represent part of the story of dispossession of country for First Nations people, the arrival of Europeans and the sheep and cattle into grassy ecosystems, and the loss of cultural practices and food plants that came with that. I think it's important I acknowledge this talk presents information from an ecological and conservation science perspective and not a cultural perspective. So to start with, how do we get grasslands, these vast grassy ecosystems where trees can't get a hold? Well, key factors are typically climate, low rainfall or extreme temperatures, soil type, things like cracking clays or shallow basalt soils, and disturbance regimes. And just in case some people aren't familiar with the term disturbance, it's ecological lingo for an event or a physical force that disrupts an ecosystem. For grasslands around the world, disturbance regimes mostly relate to fire or grazing. These events consume above ground biomass and alter other physical aspects of the soil and vegetation. The classic example is mega herbivores like wildebeest roaming the Great Plains of Africa in vast herds of tens of thousands of individuals. But each grassland biome around the world has its own version of this. So ongoing frequent disturbance events like grazing fire are critical to the maintenance of grassland communities once they form. And that is because the frequent consumption of above ground plant matter or biomass prevents dominance of only a few species, typically grasses that can outcompete the plants around them. The diagram here further explains the point why irregular or not enough biomass management is a problem for a grassland. These text boxes highlight some of the key issues that can emerge. So if we look at some of those, things like sustained growth of grass tussocks, shades out into tussock spaces, things to do with reduced light and germination sites. In some plant communities, the continued growth of tussock leads to shedding and rotting of their meristems and death of the dominant grass types. And even the decay itself can imbalance the kind of nutrient cycle and start favouring weeds. So that's just there's a few of them, but it is a kind of self-perpetuating cycle. So collectively, and with vegetation remaining in this state for an extended period, say over a few years, diversity can rapidly decline. Now, this is a diagram of typically see where there's frequent disturbance. So again, in a few of these text boxes, you can see that, regular fire or grazing can remove the dominant grass, creating these canopy gaps and keeps the tussocks healthy. There's increased light and moisture at different places. There's more flowering and seed production, and it allows more germination sites and kind of more of a natural kind of microclimate as well. So as long as a grassland can exist in this open state for extended periods, it should be able to support this high level of diversity, because these are the kind of conditions the ecosystem evolved and existed under for thousands or millions of years. And I should highlight that just as important as it is for plants, biomass removal helps maintain the open habitat required by grassland animals. A key reason many of our grassland critters like plains wanderers, dunnarts and eeless dragons are threatened is they depend on open intertustic space, which is often lost when the grassland isn't managed properly. And this is an important point. Like I said, if you don't have frequent disturbance, you will lose diversity over time, be it at different rates depending on historical factors. So now if we think about the Australian context and what disturbance regimes interacted with grasslands, grazing by kangaroos and burning by First Nations people would have been key processes that shaped landscapes, particularly in the grasslands around Melbourne. In the grasslands and chenopod shrublands on the dry Riverina Plains in northern Victoria, burning may not have been needed so frequently, but things would have burnt when biomass built up over time. And the burning of country was always deliberate and targeted in response to what country needed, and plants and animals therefore adapted to this regime as it continued over thousands of years. And then, obviously, upon European arrival, that careful management of country rapidly ended, as well as the removal of people from country. We saw rapid extinction of small digging mammals like bandicoots and bettongs that helped turn over soil and keep it healthy. We also transformed the landscape for kangaroos. They lost their natural predators in dingoes, and we built dams that provided year-round water close to grass. And that meant where there was tree cover available for kangaroos to shelter, their numbers could reach unsustainable levels. And that's even though these ecosystems evolved with kangaroos, without time to recover from grazing, kangaroos can also damage grassland health, particularly for the highly palatable species like kangaroo grass. And on the flip side, in fragmented and open grassland remnants, say in agricultural or suburban environments, where kangaroos can or won't go, a lack of disturbance, grazing or burning, biomass accumulation sees rapid degradation of diversity. So for grassy ecosystems, it really has been a case of the extremes causing their decline, overgrazing of many wooded areas and lack of grazing in many open fragmented grasslands. Another part of the colonisation story has been the arrival of these new large herbivores, sheep and cattle, into grasslands. It's a story that has impacted grasslands around the world. Native herbivores have been displaced and livestock introduced. And this switch has seen fundamental changes in the composition and function of grasslands. In many places, it's difficult to understand exactly what grasslands look like before livestock grazing. The only real close to reference points we find are typically in cemeteries, roadsides, and travelling stock routes. In most of our other grasslands, hundreds of years of livestock grazing has created these new grazing-derived grassland communities. But it's not all bad. These landscapes can still support high levels of grassland diversity when grazed sustainably. And now, as we have come to accept these new grassland states and the biodiversity they can support, livestock grazing has become a tool to protect what we have left. Because the alternatives like cropping or no grazing and burning means these places will disappear. And that's been recognised in other places around the world. The example I've got here, the Audubon grazing certification, is just one example in the prairies of North America, where livestock grazing is recognised as an important process in stopping the extinction of a suite of threatened grassland birds. But I do acknowledge the impacts of livestock grazing on grasslands is complex. So as I've already highlighted, removal of biomass is important to grasslands, and livestock can do that. Grazing does, however, have other impacts. If we think about differences between pre-European kangaroo grazing and livestock, each different herbivore likes to eat different things, and their mouth is designed so they have access to different plants. There's also the obvious difference in that kangaroos were soft-footed, and sheep and cattle have hard hooves and are heavier, meaning they do pug the soil and cause greater compaction. Livestock also move and graze differently than kangaroos would have. Kangaroos would have moved great distances between water, shelter, and feeding grounds, distributing grazing pressure differently across the landscape. Whereas we place sheep and cattle in a paddock with a trough of water, meaning they just sit there all day, every day, eating. And of course, unless you move them on, they'll just keep eating. And they also defecate differently. Big paddies and small pellets, which we probably don't really understand the impacts of, but it most certainly probably does influence the distribution of resources, nutrients across the grassland, and has interactions with invertebrates and microorganisms. So there are a range of impacts that come with livestock, but I do want to focus on the role of livestock as biomass removers. And so to try and visualize this, I thought I would present this simple diagram. Processes like fire indiscriminately remove biomass. So if you imagine a fire burnt everything in a patch, it would look something like this immediately after the fire. And it would start to grow back and be in open state for 1 or 2 years. Now, livestock grazing can also open up the grassland, but the grazing might be more selective, not removing all plants, just the tasty ones. That still gives you an open state, though, where there's room for intertussock species to exist. But the long-term consequence of allowing livestock to be selective and not allowing sufficient rest and recovery post-grazing would be that the palatable species would struggle under this regime. And that is typically what you see where the livestock management approach is set stocking, where you have a set number of livestock in a paddock for extended periods, potentially never resting the paddock from that grazing pressure. And that approach generally supports a greater diversity can come from a different approach, which is rotational grazing, where livestock are moved onto a different paddock for a period and the plants are afforded an opportunity to flower and seed. There's also another grazing approach that can be very effective for minimizing selective herbivory of the palatable plant species, and that's pulse or cattle grazing or crush grazing. This approach involves a high stock rate for just a short period of time, and then plenty of opportunity for the plants to rest and recover. So in theory, it can look like this. Similar to a fire, the livestock are pushed to consume all of the biomass, the tasty and the not tasty things, and plants recovery time can be similar to a post-fire event if they're given an opportunity to rest. This approach can be really useful too if you're trying to target a vulnerable part of an unwanted exotic plant species life cycle. For example, if you wanted to knock over exotic annual weed grasses, if you target them just as they're germinating or about to flower, it can set them back and reduce their dominance, particularly if you can do that time after time. So livestock grazing can be a useful tool when done strategically, but it can also be quite damaging if done unsustainably. Overgrazing is a classic example of a process that leads to ecosystem collapse. If you don't give vegetation an opportunity to recover from grazing, and a paddock also looks like a bowling green most of the time, the grassland will dramatically lose productivity and species. So the grazing regime is really important to think about and try and get right. There's just a few of the potential impacts that I've highlighted there. So we've gone through a bit about the theory of livestock grazing in biomass removal. I'll now highlight a few real-world examples where livestock grazing has played a key role in grassland conservation. And I do acknowledge the good is relative to grasslands that might not have that have been completely unmanaged since colonisation. It's good relative to doing nothing. One recent and really significant story of livestock grazing playing a critical role in grassland conservation is the rediscovery of the Victorian grassland earless dragon on an intergenerationally managed sheep grazing property on the outskirts of Melbourne. There is strong consensus among conservationists and researchers that if it wasn't for the frequent, well-managed and ongoing grazing by sheep at this site, the dragon would have never persisted all this time. And the unfortunate reality is this kind of continuous grazing or disturbance of our grasslands around Melbourne is almost as rare as the dragons themselves. For one reason or another, there have been extended breaks or pauses in grazing or burning in almost all the large grasslands. Which means for critters like the earless dragon, they've got no home, and it's the end of the road. So it really does come down to that ongoing disturbance regime to give critters a chance, because they just can't get up and fly kilometres unlike other animals. In northern Victoria and the Riverina Plains, it's a slightly different story to around Melbourne, where there's been continuous grazing for over 200 years, which has prevented extended biomass build-up and loss of diversity. And that also goes for Terrick National Park, which some of you might be familiar with. Because the importance of disturbance regimes like grazing were identified during the park's creation in the 1990s and 2000s, and as private grazing farms were acquired for the national park, the grazing didn't stop, and sheep and cattle became a tool to manage grasses and biomass. And it's largely because of this decision, these grasslands represent some of the best and most intact grassland remnants we have in Victoria and probably Australia. So it's been a really good story. And I also have to talk about a bird that I spent a lot of my time thinking and researching, and that's the plains wanderer. This unusually and highly threatened little bird owes much of its persistence on the northern plains of Victoria to the ongoing grazing of habitat. In order to live its life mostly on the ground, it needs open intertussock space to search for food and move around. And if grasslands become too dense for too long, habitat becomes unsuitable. I won't talk much more about the relationship between vegetation structure, livestock grazing and the bird here, but I will point to a few resources if people want to learn more. For example, the Room of the Wild team, a small non-for-profit, did a wonderful little film a few years ago about the plains wanderer and its conservation, which you can watch online for free, and also shared in news about today's talk. There's also conservation partners which are launching a new project to support graziers on the northern plains in grassland management. So I also encourage people to have a look at that if they're interested. And the other thing I'll point to is recent surveys and research for the plains wanderer around Melbourne in the western grasslands is also demonstrating the importance of disturbance and livestock grazing for the plains wanderer. There has been a flurry of detection in recent years, which is very exciting. But all these detections of the bird are occurring where livestock grazing is continuing on private land, particularly in the more productive basalt grasslands, it's critical to have frequent disturbance and maintain those open spaces for species such as the plains wanderer. They just won't tolerate large areas of dense grass. So far, it's been pretty clear that where grazing has been discontinued and there isn't a really frequent disturbance regime, there have been no detections of the species, and habitat surveys are also suggesting that these areas are unsuitable because it's too dense. So livestock grazing has been integral to many grassland wins, but it's important to acknowledge there are trade-offs. Just a few of the known negative impacts, which I'll run through. The first one I've kind of already mentioned, but palatable plant species are vulnerable to grazing, particularly when they aren't given time to recover. And I call that the non-conservation grazing approach, not giving plants the ability to recover. The yam daisy is a classic example. Livestock, sheep and cattle love eating these things, very tasty, and they have disappeared from almost all grasslands where there has been ongoing grazing. There's also a number of orchid species that seem to be similarly tasty and vulnerable to grazing. So it's important to note there can be losers. It's also hard to avoid the damage to soil crust and lichens and bryophytes with the hooves of livestock. Certainly some species can persist with light grazing, but many of these kind of biocrusts can be lost. But that's not necessarily all of them. Livestock are also good at spreading weeds. And finally, the replacement of frequent burning with only grazing means that species with evolutionary adaptations to fire, things like cues to germinate with heat or smoke, will be disadvantaged and potentially lost where there is only grazing. So it's important to consider that. So after looking at some of the good and some of the bad that can come from grazing, the question might come, should I graze my block? Well, fortunately, some other people have already put some thoughts into creating a decision tree for this. So I pulled this diagram out of the Grasslands Bible, the Land of Sweeping Plains book. And this has been adapted actually from a paper by grassland guru Ian Lunt and others. As a whole, I just want to use it to demonstrate how complex a decision tree can be for this. And sorry, it's a bit blurry, but I will just point to a few of the key considerations. The first one being invasion risk for the site. You should think about, is it prone to invasion by an undesirable grazing sensitive dominant species, maybe a weedy grass? If it is palatable, then grazing is likely to be positive and can help you manage that. If not, you'll need to consider some other things. Things like, has the site ever been grazed before? Or are there any rare plants that are sensitive to grazing? If you have a site that has been regularly burnt and not grazed for a long time, introducing grazing is likely to result in negative impacts. Similarly, if a site has been supporting a population of grazing sensitive rare species because it's avoided livestock for a long time, introducing livestock will likely be a bad idea for that species anyway. And another important consideration is the dominant plant species palatable? Will the livestock actually help regulate the biomass if you introduce them? For instance, if it's serrated tussock, then the livestock won't touch it. But if it's wallaby or spear grass that you're trying to control the biomass of, then livestock can help limit its accumulation. I won't run through all of the possible scenarios here. This is just to emphasize there is a lot of complexity when it comes to thinking about, is it a good or bad idea to graze livestock? And also worth noting that this diagram, which I pulled out, is mostly focused on plant diversity rather than providing habitat for fauna. Because if it's about habitat for fauna, it can be more about the structure than the necessary diversity and composition. So that's also another thing to think about. And so once you go through a decision process like that, it might suggest that grazing could be good, but it doesn't tell you how to graze. And there are lots of things to think about when grazing a grassland. The first point is what I think is probably the most important to identify, and that's, why do you want to graze? What are you trying to do? Maybe you're trying to run a profitable livestock production business, and you're also looking to maintain good grass and soil productivity. Maybe you're trying to keep the grassland open as habitat for a species of animal, or maybe you're grazing because you can't burn and realize that it's better for the grassland to do something rather than nothing. These are all understandable positions, but it's important to clearly identify them so you can work out whether grazing is doing good. Other things to consider: the history and quality of the site. Similar to the decision tree, if the site has a long history of grazing, the impacts will be predictable, versus a high risk if there hasn't been grazing for a long time. There could be some unintended consequences. Timing. Should think about when you might want to graze, what season. This might be influenced whether your dominant kind of grasses are seed-free or seed-ball grasses. Is there a particular plant species where you want to allow it to flower and set seed? So you want to influence your movement of stock based on that. Duration and intensity of grazing. Are you able to do short, high stocking rates, or does it need to be long and the livestock is scattered across the paddock? That will influence the grazing pressure. Climate. How will you respond if you go through an extended dry period where things are growing, are not growing, or when it's wet and things are growing vigorously? You'll quickly lose biomass in drought if you can maintain the grazing pressure, but you might need to introduce more livestock if it's wet and the biomass is getting out of hand. Frequency, again, this kind of point around what kind of grazing approach do you want to have? Is it set stocking? Is it rotational? Is it crass grazing? How long are you going to give each block to rest and recover? There's a whole range of things to consider when it comes to that based on kind of the plant community. Scale. It's important to have different vegetation structure from one block to the next. Do you want some level of farm scale heterogeneity in the vegetation structure? We've got really heavily grazed sites with some open sites, trying to provide different habitat for different things. And all these different considerations are important and really important to think about. And you add on top of that opportunities to do things like introducing fire and grazing with each other. That's something that hasn't been done a lot in Australia, but it's certainly there's a bit more theory behind it in the North American prairies. But it is something that you could try. And there also is, what livestock animal do you think is most suitable? Is it sheep or cattle? And that could just depend on what's available or what's kind of common in the region. But all of these kind of nuances of grazing and grassland, they could be different from paddock to paddock, or there could be different considerations from region to region. But you do really need to weigh up all these different things. One consideration that I mentioned just then that we'll dive a little deeper into is the difference between sheep and cattle grazing in grasslands. Part of my PhD research on the Northern Plains grasslands a few years back compared some of the differences between grasslands that were grazed by sheep versus grazed by cattle. So this study took place over 3 years and mostly focused on areas grazed for conservation or as a mixture of conservation and production. And in this research, I looked at differences in bird and vegetation communities, but I'll just show you here some of the main differences we have between the structural changes in plants, vegetation. So I'll just highlight them as some interesting ones. Firstly, up here, this is vegetation biomass on the y-axis. So you can see in the red line represents the cattle graze and the blue line represents changes in the sheep graze. And you can see the higher values mean more open and the lower values more dense. And you can see cattle graze sites were always significantly more open than sheep graze sites. Another interesting one, this is cover of native grass, and it's kind of openness and cover of native grass is kind of the flip. So you can see that, yeah, cover of native grass was typically always lower where there was cattle grazing versus sheep grazing. And if we look at this one down here, the cover of native forbs, you can see that the cover of native forbs was usually higher in cattle graze compared to sheep graze, but not in every year. There were differences. There were similarities between in different years, but there were also periods where it was quite significantly different. But overall, I won't talk about all these results, but what the findings pointed to was cattle are much more likely to target grasses, particularly dry grasses, compared to sheep, which tended to like to nibble native forbs and were less likely to touch dry grass. So these types of differences are really important and can have important implications if you're using grazing as a tool. If you're really trying to knock back and get biomass down in a really dry site, then cattle might be the way to go. Or if you're trying to reduce
Adrian, I think you just turned off the sound.
they just have different impacts. Another part of my PhD research looked into the idea of disturbance switches. This is where you might decide to stop livestock grazing and move to another disturbance regime. There's certainly growing interest from land managers and some landholders to make these kinds of moves away from grazing, but it's important to understand whether there is going to be some positive, negative, or neutral outcomes for different grassland species if you're going to start introducing new things. So yeah, I tried to understand a bit more about this in my research. I set up a large-scale experimental before and after control treatment experiment. These experiments were conducted across 4 sites in Northern Plains grasslands, and at each of these sites we had 4 different treatments implemented over 6-hectare plots, so they're quite large plots, 6 hectares. The treatments included a burning treatment, a high-intensity, short-duration crash grazing treatment, like I spoke about earlier, and that was done with sheep. There was a treatment with no grazing or burning, what I call an exclusion, and then there was the controlled treatment, which was just the status quo level of light grazing that was happening in those areas. And then throughout the 3 years of the study, I surveyed grassland birds, vegetation structure, invertebrates, and seed production. I also captured these photo points in this picture here, which you can see, which was a nice way to visualize how things were changing. I should add that we had published this work, so if you want to read the paper and learn more in depth, there it is there in the bottom corner. So what do we find? These figures show the different trends for different habitat attributes under the 4 treatments across the life of the experiment. I won't go through all of them, but we'll highlight a couple of things. Because there's a lot going on. So I'll just point out a few interesting results. In this top left panel, we have vegetation openness. Again, it's where the high value equals more open. And this one, we see that immediately after the treatments are implemented, the line there, we see the burning and crush grazing treatments significantly increase in openness. They're the green and purple lines. We also see that the exclusion treatment, which is the long pink dash, quickly becomes more closed than the other treatments, except by the end of the treatment, the burn treatment and the exclusion treatment actually is similar, which probably signals that it could do with another burn again, because that's what all this comes down to. It should be this is about a regime rather than one-off. The other one I'll point to is the cover exotic annual grasses. You can see in this one the reverse pattern to vegetation openness. So down here in the middle figure I'm talking about. The burning and crush grazing result in immediate reductions after that first lot of treatments, while exclusion and control have higher cover of exotic annual grass, which is what you don't want. And this trend continues throughout the life of the project, which suggests burning and crush grazing could be useful strategies if you're trying to knock down the cover of exotic weedy grasses. And the last one I'll point to is native plant richness, which is down the bottom. And for this one, treatments actually remain quite similar for the first year. They're all kind of on a level playing field, but begin to separate over time, with richness actually being greatest in the control and lowest in the exclusion treatment in the final year of so down here by the final season of sampling. The control was the highest richest. And I think that's a really interesting result, because it shows that just because you introduce a new type of management, you don't automatically see a bunch of new species popping out of nowhere and some great diversity. The species that persist in these sites have undergone really long periods of selection under this status quo regime, and any species that may have benefited from things like fire have long dropped out of the system. So in this case, it tells us if we want to reintroduce new types of management, we should consider actively returning plant species through seed or propagule addition to see maximum benefit. Just changing and tweaking disturbance types might not get the result we're after. Now I'm going to show you responses. No, I'm not going to show you the responses of birds. That's probably for another talk. But I will show you the responses of epigeal, which means ground-dwelling invertebrates in these figures. To start, I put a caveat around these results because I have a small sample size for looking at faunal responses, and we do see a significant difference with one of the treatments before we've even switched the disturbance type, which I've that line in. The treatment effect issue. So we clearly had some strange outlier event going on at one of the plots. But nonetheless, a few interesting patterns. So to start with, invertebrate abundance here on the y-axis, if you just forget about the burn treatment because it's some weird stuff going on, you do see you really don't see any changes emerge, except significantly greater numbers in the winter 2019, which there was obviously one season where things kind of separated out, but by the end of it, again, they're all kind of similar. And then if we look here at the invertebrate richness, species richness, we also don't see any clear differences through time, but there are some seasons, again, with significant differences. Like in spring 2019, we saw significantly greater richness in some things. And in summer, there was also significantly lower richness in the exclusion treatment. Again, but by the end of the study period, they're all kind of similar. They're all coming back at a similar level. And again, I think these results suggest that we shouldn't expect to see immediate big changes after a disturbance type switch. These grasslands are likely in a stable state, which will require additional management interventions to see real major significant positive changes. Moving on from ecological responses, I thought it'd be important just to flag some of the important practical logistical considerations when it comes to decisions around biomass management. Whether it's livestock grazing or burning, there are associated costs and risks with the different approaches. And as much as someone might want to only use burning to manage your grassland, it may simply be more viable to maintain a livestock grazing regime. So think about costs. Livestock grazing must come with considerations around whether you're owning your own flock or herd, or you're relying on agistment where you borrow your livestock from a neighbour or another farmer to graze your site. You must also have the ability to move the herd around between the paddocks, and you must have good fencing and water points to ensure you can evenly graze every area that you need to. And then for fire, you need special burning and firefighting equipment. There's usually significant planning and preparation that goes into a burn, particularly in a complex environment. And if you're relying on contractors or other agencies, the cost of using their resources can be very high. And in terms of risks, for livestock grazing, it is mostly about the ecological consequences, whereas for fire, the consequences for getting a burn wrong can be very significant, particularly if it escapes with potential risks to infrastructure and worst case human life. And that's certainly another challenge that is growing with climate change, with extreme flips in weather between hot and dry to wet. Finding safe burn windows can be a real challenge, and which can influence the way that you might go about managing your biomass. Just to wrap up, now just a few take-home messages. Firstly, I want to emphasise that grasslands need people and they need management. Doing nothing is not an option. Whether it's livestock grazing or some other disturbance, biomass needs to be frequently reduced, and it's all about the regime coming back and doing it again and again as the biomass needs. The second point, it's important to be clear about why livestock grazing, if that's what you want to do, is the right tool for the management of a grassland. Is it about managing habitat for an animal? Is it about reducing dominance of grasses so native forbs can flourish? Or was it about maximizing grassland productivity for maybe production of livestock? Or maybe it's about fuel loads. And you can then use what you kind of said as your clear goal to guide how you graze. The approach is really important. Is rotational or crash grazing the best approach, or is the best approach to graze through only autumn and winter and rest through summer and spring because of the type of grass species you have? Understanding what plant or animal species you want to see and which species you don't want to see will help you decide on the optimal grazing regime. I would, however, say you need to be prepared to learn and adapt. As many of you will know, there are no 2 years in a grassland that are ever the same. You'll see different things going at different times and in different ways, which means grazing management must be able to respond to the conditions, and you might need to adapt your plans as you go. So that's the end. I'm hoping this summary of grazing grasslands was useful to you all, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dan. That was So many questions in my head. I hope people are throwing them in the chat. I haven't had a chance to look yet, but we do have some. That's great. I wanted to ask you about palatability, Dan, if I may, just to start people off. You mentioned, sorry, I shouldn't be looking over there. I should be looking at you. That
Mm.
Dan, not that Dan. Um, I should you mentioned yam daisies, you mentioned kangaroo grass, you mentioned orchids. Are there
Mm.
particular families or groups of plants that are more palatable to sheep or cattle, and do they differ? Um, yeah.
That's a good question, and probably, yeah, I probably can't give you a great answer. I don't know whether I would consider any kind of, yeah, specific families. It just does tend to be specific species. Like the yam daisy, for example, using experience from the Northern Plains. Yeah, it just absolutely struggles with grazing, whereas other geophytes like chocolate lilies and bulbine lilies don't seem to be impacted in the same way. It does seem to be some intolerance of that species that kind of separates it from other things. And yeah, similar for kangaroo grass, I guess, to an extent. C4 grasses do seem to maybe be a bit more vulnerable. I guess they're growing in summertime. So yeah, if you're stressing them out and it's already kind of a hard time to grow, if you're trying to grow through a hot, dry summer, then yeah, you can knock C4 grasses out pretty well. But yeah, again, as a species, kangaroo grass seems to be pretty vulnerable.
Okay. We have a start us off on the wild question. So we have an off-topic question, which is
Mm.
about solar panels on grasslands. I've seen a lot of media coverage about this, but it's is there solar panels are thinking that because evidence of sheep producing better wool when grazed under panels, wool was cleaner and grasses grow more consistently due to water collection over panels. Do you have any thoughts on solar panels and grasslands and biodiversity grazing?
Yeah, and again, probably not something I've had the opportunity to really look into. I've thought about it and I've seen the media around that as well, which I thought was interesting. Yeah, I do wonder, getting those solar panels in the ground in the first place must involve a degree of earth moving and machinery, which I imagine if you're putting into a native grassland might cause problems. To my knowledge, I'm not aware of yeah, those solar panel farms and grazing going on a native grassland as opposed to some just kind of exotic pasture. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how that played out in a native grassland. But yeah, to my knowledge, I don't think it's happened.
Hmm. There'd be a lot of great shading involved, of course.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I think there'd definitely be winners and losers in terms of yeah, that microclimate that they must create.
Hmm. Hmm. Deb Riddles asks if you looked at invertebrate diversity, which we can see you did do a little bit. Is there anything more you'd like to tell us about the invertebrate story that perhaps wasn't captured in those graphs that you put up?
Uh yeah, I looked at diversity and richness, and they were kind of telling the similar story in terms of responses to those different treatments and reintroducing different disturbance types. Yeah, there's a lot of ups and downs and differences between seasons, but no real clear trends that seem to be favoured. Um, yeah, I would have loved to have kind of done that experiment a few more years and a few more different climate cycles, because yeah, I think the climate has a huge say in things, in how things respond. But yeah, over the duration of my study, yeah, things weren't really separating out with invertebrates much at all. Yeah, there wasn't much difference.
Hmm. It's a really interesting result, that one. It's
Mm,
um so can you I'm quite ignorant. I don't understand pugging. I mean, I understand that pugging happens more with cattle than sheep, and it's when the soil's wet and so on. But
mm,
obviously, it sort of wrecks the soil surface. But what effect does it actually have in the long term? Does it kill off different species? Does it kill seedlings? What goes on?
From what I've seen on the northern plains, it's interesting. Pugging, it tends, because there's the soil, the clays up there tend to shrink and expand. The pugging seems to work itself out of the soil. The pugging never is really permanent.
Mm,
But I think in terms of things that are kind of sensitive to disturbance, like some particular soil crusts and things, like you do just lose them.
mm,
So it's definitely something you need to be conscious of. I also think there might be a relationship between the pugging, the footmark of hooves and germination sites for exotic grasses. You tend to see a lot of exotic grasses germinating within those
mm.
the little microclimate of the pug.
All right.
So again, yeah, obviously they like disturbance, and the pugging is like a little micro disturbance. So I think it can almost create situations worse where if you've kind of got those annual grasses that they do kind of enjoy that level of disturbance. So yeah, you've kind of got a bit of a cycle going on where the livestock eat the exotic grass, but then they're also creating more exotic grass if you've kind of doing lots of pugging. But you can certainly avoid the worst of pugging, particularly if you can move livestock out of sensitive areas that get particularly wet and are particularly
Mm,
vulnerable to plugging. If it gets really wet, just keep them out of there's usually a pretty good idea. And also significant time resting the grassland. They can persist, like some of the best examples of native grassland have excellent biocrust and also grazed. So I think if it's done sustainably, they can coexist. But yeah, it's definitely a bit of a balancing act in getting it right.
mm. And just on the biocrust, can you tell me like what the virtue of the biocrust is? Just apart from being a really cool thing. It's
Well, yeah, I guess it's own kind of living organism that creates its own little microclimate, microsites for the germination of other plants that kind of have a kind of a symbiosis with it. Um, kind of prevents erosion and evaporation. So it does play a really important part in the function of grasslands. And yeah, when you see a really intact grassland, yeah, the biocrusts are really amazing. Kind of they're colourful and lots of different patterns and textures. So yeah, they are doing something.
the Northern Plains do them especially well, don't they? Uh,
Mm,
yeah.
yeah, and they
Um,
can get some great ones.
yeah. Jasmine has a question here. What technique did you use to measure structure within grasslands? Would you recommend the use of a structure pole? I was also wondering if you noticed increasing diversity with increasing paddock rest.
There were with the, I guess, yeah, didn't really have the opportunity to look at paddock rest in a lot of detail. I guess you could argue the crush grazing treatment is an approach where you do allow a site to have a lot of rest. So if you look at some of the responses into that treatment, and again, the plant diversity didn't really um, do what we were expecting after the full 3 years of the project.
Mm,
The diversity wasn't dramatically better in any of the new disturbance types we put in. But I think there is certainly an argument or a theory that, more sustainable grazing approaches should provide greater biodiversity. But yeah, there isn't a lot of hard data or research around it, unfortunately. And in terms of structure, I'm not sure people are familiar with the golf ball method.
mm,
Uh, yeah, kind of created a few years ago by Nick Schultz and John Morgan, dropping golf balls and scoring them based on their visibility. I won't go into the whole how you do it kind of thing, but I use the golf ball method regularly. You can Google it and learn how to do it. But I found it really a useful technique in rapidly assessing what the openness, the intertussock space of a grassland's doing, And then, yeah, simply looking at the kind of measuring the height of different components of at different points with a structure pole works well. And then, yeah, cover estimates using quadrats and things like that. Kind of my go-tos. But yeah, I spend a lot of my time just kind of looking at faunal responses in grasslands, and a lot of it comes down to structure and openness, which is why I really like the golf ball technique.
Yes, we had Mark Antos talk to us about grassland birds a few talks ago, and it was a real eye opener in terms of like the importance of structure rather than the floristic complexity or anything like that.
Yep.
What we had another question back to different sorts of grazing. The macropod, are the same species palatable to livestock that are palatable to macropods, or like do they produce different results?
I think some things yes, other things no. I think an example where there's a lot of similarity is kangaroo grass. Speaking from my bush heritage reserves that I work on, heavily favoured by kangaroos, and similarly, livestock grazing has completely knocked kangaroo grass out of a lot of areas as well. So that there must be some nutrition palatability of kangaroo grass that all kind of herbivores seem to like. But then, then different geophytes and things. It seems I think livestock have a more of a taste for things like the lilies and yams compared to kangaroos. They don't seem to go for them as hard as livestock do. So that there are certainly differences. It's not something I've had the opportunity to really collect data on, but just observations. There seems to be some overlap with some things and not with others, which is you'll probably find that species to species.
Someone's talking here about the finding enough stock at the right time, and is there a consideration of either mobile grazing flock or subsidies to encourage existing farmers to adjust when needed? So I know I keep thinking Parks Victoria, for instance, should be grazing the Western Grassland Reserve, but they refuse to have a flock. But maybe they could borrow a flock. Can you do that sort of thing?
Well, yeah, that's exactly how Terrick National Park operates. There are contracts, agreements between local graziers and park project officers, and when the grasslands based on Parks Victoria's needs, they put the request out, and the sheep move in, and the farmers get a free feed for their livestock, and there's the conservation outcome. So it's not completely new ground to be breaking to set up those kinds of arrangements. It's both sides can benefit. But yeah, obviously the challenge around Melbourne is there's probably fewer and fewer farmers potentially as the kind of urban growth boundary expands, and maybe finding those good relationships, and particularly up on the northern plains, it's really fortunate there are a few large grazing families who really are good operators and want to help out. So it's all about finding those relationships and trying to maintain them. It's but having said that, situations, say when you get a really wet year and the grass is growing everywhere, sometimes the farmer isn't going to move his stock off his block because the pasture will go rank unless he keeps it down. So the conservation reserve might not be prioritised in that instance, but most of the time that agreement does work well.
Can I ask you about I guess going back to like private farmers, like in terms of engagement, like the decision tree that you showed us there, that was really complex, and the different types of grazing that you've taken us through, which are also complex. Is there a general level of understanding with private graziers about what the best way of going is? Like I know your experience is more up the north, but also like in across the volcanic plain. Are there differences in regions? Is it yeah.
Um, yeah, I guess my experience is kind of restricted to the Northern Plains in that respect, but I think there's a real spectrum in terms of I guess the kind of complexity of the farming decision making and how they go about the operations. There's some farmers that you'll meet who are super into like the kind of uh, uh, the productivity and the soil and when things should come on and off, and there are others that just kind of throw the cows out there. Oh, that looks a bit short, I might move them in a week or so. And then there's everything in between. So potentially there's a regional thing. I like certainly in northern Victoria, there is a bit of a like a regenerative ag kind of component, but it's not huge, say around Terrick. So it's kind of more of an old school farmers, but they have a soft spot for things like the Plains Wanderer and some of the native grasslands. So yeah, it's there's a huge spectrum out there.
Hmm. Hmm. Other questions, people? Anyone want to just interject rather than use the chat? John Del Pratt.
All right, Dan, thanks. Sort of almost following on from Adrian's question there, do you know of enterprises, purely commercial enterprises, which have successfully prioritised grassland management as well?
Do you mean like balancing conservation and kind of profit making from livestock grazing? Is that what you mean?
That's what I mean, and not necessarily through yeah, not necessarily So having a successful commercial enterprise which which consciously considers grassland management as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There's probably a handful of farmers in northern Victoria which I'd say have been able to juggle that really well. And the unfortunate thing is, though, a lot of it's I think it's common across the board is they're kind of reaching retirement age, and there isn't necessarily that next generation of engaged, the engaged generation coming through, which is really concerned in the conservation space because there's some of these people we've been working with 20, 30 years, who who've made a pretty good living out of running livestock, but they also engage really strongly with people doing work in the conservation space, letting researchers and scientists out to do things with the bird and additional kind of land management things that don't necessarily help them with livestock grazing, but absolutely make a lot of difference for the species that their farms are supporting. So I think it's getting a bit harder and harder to find those examples there.
Dan, just a couple of quick follow-ups, if I may. The younger farmers just under too much financial pressure, or have they been educated differently, or is there? And my other question there is there advice? Is there now consultancy advice available to them? Is that building up that sort of enterprise that it can actually consult in an informed way about these matters?
Well, it is kind of the space that I mentioned them before, but Conservation Partners, it's an NGO which is recently moving into the Patho Plains grassland space. It's trying to address this issue of the kind of generational kind of succession issue, and supporting those farmers who need a bit of extra support at the moment, and also trying to come up with pathways where we can kind of maintain some continuity. But the challenge is, and I think it's across the world probably is the next children start kind of taking up farming for I guess there must be a whole kind of complexity of reasons. I'm not exactly sure why it's a pretty tough living. You don't get a day off. And it's lots of...
I mean more with the younger generation of farmers who are actively involved. Are they just not engaging with this sort of? Are they just under too much financial pressure to engage with any ideas of conservation, or have you another explanation?
Well, yeah, certainly. Again, just the Northern Plains example, there, like I could probably only think of one or two examples where a younger someone in the family is taking up the farm after their kind of parents are retiring. It's just not happening. But then, like I mentioned, that's where I'm hoping someone like Conservation Partners comes in, and if for those people who are keen to take it on, let's throw a heap of support at them and try and build it up and ensure that kind of knowledge that that has been gained from decades of balancing livestock production and conservation. That's passed on.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you.
And just on that heap of support, is there Bush Heritage does that sort of thing, but what about like other like Shire Council, state government? Do they are there good mechanisms in place to try and get conservation values and farming working together?
Not really, I guess, is probably the short answer. It's definitely a space that I think needs a lot more attention. As you're aware, we're just dealing with a lot of kind of grassland clearing and things that councils and shires don't particularly quick to help us out with. But I guess the other one is people like Trust for Nature. There are over the years been good kind of incentive programs for things like covenanting grasslands. Grasslands also can be grazed, so that has worked well as a bit of a kind of a carrot for doing it. But there's definitely scope for more help.
Yeah, indeed. Rosemary, you're going to tell us about the urban growth boundary, I expect.
Oh, well, I did put it in the chat, but just to make the point, the urban growth boundary isn't steadily expanding. It's it hasn't changed since 2012. There was a lapse in 2010 and 2012 when Labor and Liberal governments sort of worked successively to take 50,000 hectares out of the green wedges. But since then, it hasn't moved. And, in recent years since then, basically, the major parties, the three major parties, if we include the Greens, have all supported a permanent UGB. So hopefully it won't ever move again.
It does fill up though, doesn't it, Rosemary? It is filling up, and that's pushing farmers out to some extent.
Well, I think what's happening is inappropriate uses are being allowed in the green wedge. So somebody thought it would be a good idea to allow churches and schools because they're good things. But if you fill up your green wedges with churches and schools, you don't have any green wedges left. And now, of course, there's data centres and other things that shouldn't be in green wedges that, there's a contest. I mean, there are residents who are fighting those uses. And our group, the Green Wedges Coalition, we're supporting those residents, working with them, acting as a kind of network. But as the other thing I was going to mention is that in terms of transitioning, you're quite right. A lot of the younger generations happen in my family, where the younger generations go off into finance or something and don't want to keep on the farm. There's also aspiring farmers who find it hard to get into farming. And there's a group called Future Farming, where there's a bloke who was one of those young farmers who missed out on the farm when it was divided up equally among all the kids. He started a group called Future Farming, and he gets investors, puts together an investor, a retiring farmer and an aspiring farmer. And he's got about 20 farms that have transitioned from a retiring farmer to an aspiring farmer. So this is one of the things that actually allows that tradition of like family farms to continue, because the retiring farmer does a fair bit of mentoring of the aspiring farmer, and the investor puts their money in and then takes it out when the aspiring farmer can afford to pay him back. So just a suggestion.
No, thanks for sharing that initiative. It's kind of exactly what I've been trying to find lately. So I might look that one up.
No, fantastic. Hey, it's getting to 7:50. Does anyone have any further questions that they'd like to ask Dan? Now's the opportunity. Erwin, was that a question? Yes.
Yes, I would like to add a thank you to Rosemary to pull me into this. I'm originally from the Netherlands, and we met last week at a Plumpton community gathering where they're planning to build the biggest data center of Australia right on my doorstep. And I have had the pleasure to design the world's most efficient data center in the Netherlands a bit more than 20 years ago. I just looked up the ranking while we had the meeting now going on. It's still one of the top efficient ones. And the American way of engineering data centers, especially causing a global uproar, triggered me to join this group to do absolutely everything to stop this madness happening right at my doorstep. So thank you, Rosemary, for giving me the insights of what was discussed tonight. And I'm more than happy.
Thank you for coming, Ewan, and apologies, Adrian. I did actually send you an email in advance saying that might be people from that group. So there was some interest in the environmental aspects, and
Yes.
I just said to people, you've got this amazing Western volcanic plains grassland here. This is really worth saving. It isn't just about the impact on you or the noise and things like that, although they're obviously important, but you've got something worth saving here. And so you might find more people. Yeah.
And the power that unlocked, that two people were really outrageously angry at that session, but a lot of the people were very respectful.
Yes.
And just wanted to do absolutely amazing. A similar story to Dan was just explaining before. And I just now get asked a lot of technical, detailed questions on how you can do it so extremely efficient that it is still world leading. So just wanted to share that knowledge is existing, and it was unlocked by angry people just living in Melbourne's north. So
Okay. We have one person just asking for the link to your Dutch design, your design. If you could chuck that in the chat, if you have an opportunity, some resource to point us to, that would be great. Do we have any other questions that pressing matters that we need to find out from Dan the truth of? No, all good. Okay, let's wrap up then. It's 7:53, so let's just take a 10-minute break and come back at 8:03. Thank you, Dan. It's been an absolute pleasure to hear your talk and to get that depth of research and observation and everything. And it's I'm sure we'll have you back for a third time or something. Perhaps grazing in woody situations. I think that would be the next one, wouldn't it?
You could definitely fill a talk with that one as well, I think.
Okay, brilliant.